Christina, I have to ask, why was the witch late to their coven gathering?
I don't know, Doug. Why was the witch late to their coven gathering?
Their broom overswept.
Ouch.
Ow. Just ouch. That's I'll take an ouch. An ouch is fun. Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Magic Is. This is a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and sometimes, every once in a while, you have to release an episode about something that the people haven't voted for in the Patreon. It's about a topic that I think has to be covered on the show, and this podcast has been going on for 5 years, and I am shocked that I have not covered this. So today we are going to cover it. Everybody, don't click away. Trust me, you are going to want to listen to this show because I have a fantastic topic and I have a wonderful guest to talk about it. And so today's topic is going to be something I'm sure all of you have heard of, which is Wicca. And my guest should be familiar to all those who live in the British Isles. They have been interested in spirituality and magic since childhood and grew up in West Africa, Burma, and Chile, only moving to the West at the age of 15. In her early 20s, she discovered Europe's mystical and magical traditions and hasn't looked back. She's a former academic with a doctorate in medieval history, but left the world of academia in 2001 to start what is the greatest occult and magic bookshop in the world. I'm not just saying that, it is. And a place that I had the extreme privilege to talk at last month, Treadwell's Bookshop in London. Today, I am delighted to welcome to What Magic Is This, the one and only Christina Oakley-Harrington. Christina, how are you today?
Really well. I'm feeling really happy to be here and really looking forward to talking about witches.
It's shocking to me because of a couple of things. I have a poll that I put up in the Patreon, and I have done it at least 8 times, and almost 6 of those times I put in Wicca, and it never gets enough votes to put it into the category that allows me to cover it. And I just got tired of that. So it's like, we have to, it's such a big part of everything in the magical world in the West. And the fact that I haven't talked about it is shocking to me. So I want to kick this off mainly by relating a story, which is an interesting one because it's going to tie into the discussions that we're going to have later. But I went for a haircut about a year ago, and as one does, they're in the barber chair, and the person cutting my hair asks me what I do, and I say that I have a podcast. And then she asks, what's the podcast about? And I say, well, it's about esoteric philosophy and mysticism, and I never say witchcraft or magic. It's just esoteric philosophy, mysticism, things of that nature. And she goes, "Oh, cool. I'm a Wiccan. I'm a witch." And we get talking, and then she starts talking about the fact that Wicca is the oldest religion in the world, in the West. It's been around for thousands of years, and she didn't really know who she was talking to because it's like, I know that that's not true, but I just, to be polite, I just held my tongue and just decided to let it go. So let's kick this off. Again, there's a lot of misconceptions, but there's a lot of things that people who think they know about Wicca don't know about Wicca. So assuming that some folks are unaware, which I greatly doubt, how would you describe Wicca to somebody who has no idea what it is?
Next question, please.
We can go straight to the end. We'll just go right.
It's the reason why I have to say next question, please, is because it's a word that has morphed in its meaning so fast that the answer to that is a story, not a definition.
Right. Okay. So let's start with this then. What was the witch cult hypothesis?
The witch cult hypothesis. So let's imagine we're in 1922 and we're in the middle of London in Bloomsbury, and we're in a little sitting room, I think what you Americans call a living room, and we're drinking tea with an Egyptologist, very, very small, short woman named Dr. Murray, Margaret Murray, and she's telling us, as we're drinking her tea, that the religion of pre-Christianity, anywhere in the world, any anthropologist will tell you a non-Christian religion that has magic is called by all anthropologists, or most anthropologists in 1922, is called some sort of witchcraft. And the witchcraft of the British Isles, she says that the traces of it are found in the records of witch trials, in which the people being persecuted and brought up before the judges are describing a pagan religion in which they are witches, which means members, initiates, because like most pagan religions, it had an initiatory core, people who were initiated into a secret society. And she has just written a book about it called The Witch Cult in Western Europe that she did as a summer project while staying with the two lesbians of Glastonbury who own the chalice well, who told her that this was true and she should research it. And so she did that a few years before, during the war. So that is the witch cult thesis, that there was a pagan religion. It survived underground during the period of Christianity, and that traces of it, survivals, if you were, could be found in English folklore and could be evidenced in the confessions of witches put on trials.
Did she also write an entry about the witch cult hypothesis for Britannia at some point?
Encyclopedia Britannica, yeah, she did do that.
Yeah. Who was Charles Leland?
Charles Leland was a folklorist who could research and write at a speed almost unknown to humans who are not on masses of amphetamines. He was a Victorian gentleman who researched Etruscans, Romany, gypsy cultures, and Italian folklore, and loads of other things. He also wrote books on the use of the will and all sorts. He was American and just a prodigious producer of folklore. And one of his pieces of folklore was a book called Aradia, Gospel of the Witches, in which he alleged to have met a witch called Maddalena and learned about a witch cult in Italy. And that book was one that was read by the people who got witchcraft together as a pagan religion in the early 20th century. That was a book that they read. And they were also, at least one of them we know, is a big fan of Leland. That book is Leland's Aradia is a problematic book, but it is an icon of history, of 20th century witchcraft history.
Before we dive into the founding and most important character in this story, in this entire episode, what was the occult and magical climate of England specifically from the 20s to about the 50s? Was it mainly things like lodges and group magic? Like what was going on for the most?
All sorts going on.
Yeah.
In the 1920s and 1950s, there was, in the wider culture, in the literary and artistic culture, a huge interest in Pan and moon goddesses. And there was also a tremendous inclination towards the reclamation of the countryside, which was fast disappearing in the Edwardian era, to the building of Manchester and the industrial spread, and then the suburban spread. So there was massive loss of green land that really aroused many, many English people's concern about human beings' relationship to nature. It was also a time in which many people belonged to up to 5 clubs. It was a time of great joining. Joining things was normal, and people belonged to loads of associations. This is relevant when we start talking about witchcraft. The other thing that's going on in the early 20th century is a great interest in the history of religion, anthropological and philosophical history of religion. So big questions about what is the nature of religion beyond monotheism, and what is the primal religious instinct. So Jung is doing that, but so are people like Charles Bachhofen and various other religious scholars. And they're trying, some of them are going back in time to try to understand what is religiosity when you're a caveman, and some are going down. What is religiosity at a core level, of a feeling level, before we have anything organized or externally imposed? It's a time of great interest, and with that is a tremendous upsurge of questioning of the values of Christianity and the culture of Christianity. The shaming of sex is now very seriously being questioned. The injunction of Christianity for women to be silent and obedient is being challenged by the suffrage movement and thinking people generally.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Christina, but was witchcraft outlawed in England at this time? Was that something that was legally, if they caught you doing what they considered to be witchcraft, you could be charged or imprisoned? Was there?
There's a myth around that. It was the law against witchcraft by the time we get to the 1920s is a law against taking gullible people's money and pretending to offer them solutions.
Right.
It is a fraudulent fortune teller's law. And it is correctly renamed in 1951 it's called the Fraudulent Mediums Act. So the great song and dance about the fact that there was, witchcraft was illegal. There was absolutely nobody having any problem with people dancing in a circle under the moon in the local woodland,
right,
or doing a spell or even a curse. That was not what that law was for. That was not what that law was applied for. And it is a lovely story, but it is an irrelevancy.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you for setting us straight. Let's introduce the major character in this story. Christina, who was Gerald Gardner?
Interestingly, he's the most important person whose name is public. He's probably not the most important person in the revival of witchcraft. He is the person who Gerald Gardner was a person who in 1939 joined a group of friends in the New Forest, which is now Hampshire, Dorset. And those friends had been practicing something that they called witchcraft, and they called themselves witches. And he joined them in 1939, just before the start of the First World War. And of all those people most of them were old at that time, he was the only one who could be out. It was a group of friends who recent evidence has shown was quite feminist, quite suffrage inclining. And one of their projects of this group of friends was to bring back the worship of the goddess and take down patriarchal monotheism and reintroduce something that had been banned under patriarchal monotheism for 2,000 years. And that was women in leadership roles in religion, i.e. the role of the priestess. And it was men and women together. Now, those of you who are listening and who have read Ronald Hutton will say, oh my gosh, she's so naive. In fact, Ronald wrote Triumph of the Moon in 1999, published in 1999, was writing it 95, 96 to 99. And at that time, the documents that he had, and that was his assessment, that Gerald had made it up on his own. But since 1999, which was 25 years ago, a lot more evidence has come to light. And what I've just said is based on that more recent evidence. And I would point people who are interested to the work of Philip Heselton. And I've also written one book myself, which is a precursor to a book that's coming out next year. Philip Heselton's book that I would point people to first, is called In Search of the New Forest Coven. And my book that's out is Dreams of Witches.
Amazing. Very cool. What was Gerald like as a person? Because he is the face. If you type in Wicca,
mm-hmm.
the first people that's going to come up is Gerald, and he's a sharp looking dude. He's kind of what you would expect somebody who founds a kind of a new religion to look like. Kind of temperament, and what's kind of his short life story.
He was, everybody who knew him, including people who were trained and initiated in witchcraft by him, called him friend. And that was the word he wanted. And that was the word that described the relationship, although he was a transmitter of the techniques he'd been taught. He was very disorganized. He could not structure a teaching in any kind of linear way. So people absorbed it from long conversations on long walks and by sunbathing, chats while sunbathing, chats while hanging out in his workshop. He loved craftsmanship and woodworking and making bits and pieces out of metal and silver. He was likable and not actually charismatic. So that was, the people who I knew were his friends, and that's what they said about him. He was also he was so nonlinear and disorganized in the way he would describe things and do things that they would get really frustrated with him sometimes. I think he's classic ADD.
Okay. But he lived for a time abroad, did he not?
Yes, he spent most of his life from the age of 16 until the age of 53 in Southeast Asia. He was a child of a wealthy merchant family, an English merchant family, and for reasons that are slightly unclear, at the age of 4 or 5, his parents put him. He had older brothers who went to nice, good schools, went to nice, good universities. But he, for reasons that, perhaps that's another story, he's put in the care of a violent alcoholic nanny and put on cruise ships where she drank a lot, picked up men, and beat him. One of the things that is most striking to me about him was he was a kind man who was a child abuse survivor.
That's a part of the story that not a lot of people pay attention to, because I think that the fact that he lived abroad and this story of his abuse earlier play into, in some way, the story of Wicca, at least in its formations. Let's talk about this then. How did Wicca come about? So there's this New Forest Coven. He's just one of a chorus of an orchestra and people in this coven. But how did Wicca finally, because the ideas are there, how did it coalesce? How did it become an actual thing out in the world?
I think how it became a thing out in the world it coalesced of a group of friends experimenting with techniques. Many of them had lived in Africa and Southeast Asia. English people in that era, many of them, every family, every friends group had somebody who had been in the Raj, in the empire. And that meant Kenya, it meant Palestine, it meant Sri Lanka, it meant Malaysia, it meant Borneo. And when people came back to England at that time, it was the time of tremendous fascination with folklore. And everyone believed that folklore was a pagan survival. So people who had been in places where there were what we would call, in inverted commas, tribal religions, had seen transpossession, drumming, seances, use of drugs to go into altered states, forming of drums, working with spirits, connecting with ancestors, dancing as a method of transcendent experience. And then when they came back to England, they were like, oh my gosh, well, what are the remains of that here? We have maypole dancing, we've got well dressing, we have bonfires at midsummer. And in order to kind of not be culturally appropriative of the cultures in which they lived, and to be appropriate to the land on which they were coming back to, those things became immensely popular, and many people understood them to be pagan things, including this group of friends, which Gerald joined in with. And they also did seances because spiritualism was big. And at some point, this group of friends, possibly after reading Margaret Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe, decided to call themselves witches. And they called themselves Wicca. Okay. And they spelled it with one C. And Gerald joined them. And it was at the beginning, in the first 10, 15 years, it was a small group of friends that was perhaps a bit fluid as people moved away and moved towards. They were experimenting with techniques of ecstasy that they associated with secret societies of pagan religions, having seen those kinds of religions, small-scale tribal religions in Africa and Asia, where they had lived and been outsiders, but had observed them. How did it get more organized? It got more organized when Gerald and his partner, his magical partner, a woman, realized that it was going to die. It was a small group of friends to begin with, and they really wanted it to survive and flourish. So 1930, I think it got started, my estimation and Philip Hesselton's estimation of when it commenced, this group of friends working experimentally. No initiations, probably no texts. This is not a text-based project. It was an ecstasy-based project. And I'm guessing 1926, 1928. Philip Heselton thinks 1930, 1935-ish. But, we'll find out more. Gerald joins in 1939, and then the war starts. And during the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, it's a very difficult time for England. The war ends in 1945, and it's a changed world. And at that point, Gerald and his partner, who asked to remain anonymous because it would ruin her if her name got out, they moved the center of affairs up to London and decided to try to get people, see who might want to join in London. And out of Gerald's pied-à-terre flat in London, in Bloomsbury, they asked friends. They started looking around more seriously for friends in London who might want to join. And it's probably between 1945 and about 1950 that, as the two of them are looking to see if other people want to join, that they start getting a little bit more codified in terms of, well, rather than just some sort of wordless thing to say, now you're a member, involving some, ecstatic dancing and some drumming, we should probably say some words. And they borrow words. And here's where they borrow from the people who have words that they like, and particularly the words of Crowley, whose poetry was a big hit with Gerald.
This comes into one of the biggest misconceptions, or at least one of the things that a lot of people, particularly in online discussions, I will see it over and over again, is that the beginning rituals of Wicca is literally just Aleister Crowley and Freemasonry. What would you say to that misconception?
Yes, but no.
Right, okay.
If you've been doing something for a long time that doesn't have words to it, and you decide you want to make it a bit more formal, you borrow words and you drop in those words. They do not mean that the authors of those words shape your project, or indeed are the origin of your project or your goals or what you've been doing. Most of the understanding of what those witchcraft rituals were about was really not about the words.
Okay.
The attainment of ecstasy, about the statement of a state of Gnostic union through the senses. And if you top and tail it with some words that you've borrowed, so be it. Those words, if you're going to use them regularly, and anybody who's a ritualist from any kind of occult background knows that repetition is your friend, because it's calming, it tops and tails. We have a trigger to our memory, a trigger to altered states, in and out. It's incredibly useful. But they didn't really bother that much where they borrowed those words from. Okay. And Crowley's poetry was wonderful, because Crowley's poetry was embodied, ecstatic. Some of it is devoted to goddess, and it is erotic. And part of the project of the early witch was to reclaim the erotic, reclaim the erotic out of sin and into spirituality in a very earthy kind of way. Whose poetry are you going to slot in when you say, oh, darling, we should have a poem here, I think. Oh, I know. So the slotting in, absolutely. But what you see on a page, of course, is only those texts. You don't have, 45 minutes of repetitive drumming, right, or 2 hours of mantra chanting, or 20 minutes of ecstatic dancing to the point of collapse. Right. Nobody needs those. These were not script people. These were not text people. They didn't understand tribal religion as needing that. All you needed was a cue when you were going to say some words that you were going to say over and over again, or you were going to recite somebody's nice poem.
During periods of turmoil, particularly in the West, we see the resurgence of things like Freemasonry. American Civil War, Freemasonry goes up. World War I, Freemasonry goes up. World War II, Freemasonry goes up. So when these things are coalescing after the end of World War II, how does Freemasonry play part of the story of Wicca?
There are two schools of history in Freemasonry. And one school of Freemasonic thought in the Edwardian period, which is the early 20th century, was an understanding that Freemasonry was something that had developed in Scotland at a particular time and had names and dates and lodge names. That was one school of thought at the time. And the other school of thought was that Freemasonry was a universal language of symbols and gestures and movements. And that you could find those in African tribal religions, you could find those in India, you could find those in Brahmanism, you could find them anywhere, because there was a universal language of symbol, embodied symbol and object symbol. That second school that I've just described was summarized and most explicitly and expansively written about by a Freemasonic historian called J.S.M. Ward. Who wrote Hiram Abiff, who was Hiram Abiff. And I think and also wrote a guidebook to basic Freemasonic ritual, which is still in print. J.S.M. Ward fell into a massive conflict in the 30s with this other school of history. And he became marginalized and eventually did have to leave the country, in fact. But his view of Freemasonry as being simply one cultural expression of fraternity that espoused and worked with these symbols and a value system was a philosophy that Gerald Gardner was completely aligned with and believed to be true, believed in the universal archetypal symbol language system. And in fact, the two men were great friends.
Oh, okay.
And they, in fact, collaborated on a museum project together. Gerald sold Ward some land when he needed to leave the country. So if you believe that and you have this ecstatic project and you want to formalize your initiation out of something that is pretty amorphous, you would, and they did, borrow from Freemasonry because it was understood to have cross-cultural, universal, cross-temporal relevance or application, or it would reach the archetypal psyche in any culture anywhere.
Okay.
And that's exactly what they did.
Yeah. Well put. Very well put. What were the first few decades of Wicca being officially a thing out in the world? There's lots of press interest in Gerald Gardner, but what's the first quarter century of the life of public Wicca like?
When they sort of got going, Gerald and his magical partner in London in 1945, and they started seeing who might want to join, they had to start doing interviews. Because and they spoke to friends. They joined the Folklore Society, which is obvious because people who are looking for pagan survivals will join the Folklore Society. They also spoke to loads of archaeologists and museum curators of antiquities, because those are people of a tremendous sensitivity to pagan religion that had goddesses in it, and people who worked with archetypal symbols. You know, if you work with museum objects, you're working with shapes and textures. So they recruited from there. The public aspect started with newspaper interviews. Now, obviously, the priestess could not do that. She was a single mother who had to support herself through giving voice and music lessons, and she lived in a village.
Was that Gardner's magical partner?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was his magical partner, and she just said, "You out me, you will die.
Right.
You know, you do not out me. You do not out me." And so Gerald began giving interviews to the press, anybody. Some of them were terrible, some were fine. And the aim of it was that this very cool thing that had been going since the mid to late 20s, that was sex positive, ecstasy positive, reclaiming religion, reclaiming goddess reverence, reclaiming friendship as a group, reclaiming religion on a friendship basis was worth saving. It was so Gerald would say, look, I'm giving interviews because like otherwise it's just going to be you, me, and the two oldies. By 1951, it was like Gerald and his magical partner, and I think 3 older people back in the old village. So the earliest public face was Gerald giving interviews saying over and over again, I am simply a member. I'm simply a member. And I have all these newspaper articles, and they say, "Oh, Gerald Gardner, you're a very famous witch." He's like, "I'm only a member." The illustrious Gerald Gardner, who's head of the witches, no, I'm only a member. But they couldn't see anybody else because anybody else would be ruined. And the publicity was expanded when in 1950, Gerald and another gentleman bought and set up a museum on the Isle of Man. And the idea was that would be both a place where they could show witchcraft in a museum setting. They could Gerald could take people on tours and see who had a sensitivity and an interest. And he could also show objects from the Coven and show witchcraft in Britain as alongside other kinds of magical traditions like ceremonial magic, grimoire magic, world magic, folk charms, and say that this is a valid part of religious culture and belief culture. And it was also a very easy address. People could write, having read a newspaper article, a magazine article, they could just write to the Witch Museum, Isle of Man, and it would get to him. And in fact, I was mentored by somebody who did exactly that as a young woman. So that was how it was public. It was not public in terms of performance. Oh. It was very clearly stated. This happens in private. I imagine some of your listeners know about mystery cults in ancient Greece and in the Mediterranean world. Everybody knew about them, but if you wanted to experience them, you had to be initiated, and you were instructed not to speak about it afterwards. And everybody who was involved in Wicca at that time knew about mystery cults and understood the shape of Wicca to be a mystery cult shape. So you didn't do it from a book. You didn't do it from out of interest. You would meet the group. You would be vetted. You would be considered. There'd be a waiting period, maybe not a very long one if they liked you, and then you would be admitted to it, and then you would start doing these ecstatic, amazing, beautiful things together in this experimental way with them.
So how does it go from Gerald being I'm only a member in the British press to Wicca now, which is millions and millions of people part of covens, and even more millions of people saying that they're a Wiccan witch? How do we get from Gerald to now? Like what goes on?
That is the story of one man. The story of the origins of Wicca is not the story of Gerald Gardner. The story of the origins of Wicca, of the universality of like the prevalence of Wicca as a DIY thing is a story of one man, and that man is Raymond Buckland. So Raymond Buckland was a British man, lived in Long Island, and he started writing back to England, having read something and corresponded with some people in England, including Gerald Gardner, and then came over and did get initiated. But he got initiated with his wife in order to take it to a coven that they had in Long Island. Okay. And that coven, operated with, 8, 10, 12, 15 people for a decade, just under a decade, at which point Raymond Buckland went his own way. And when Ray Buckland went his own way, away from that coven, he decided to reconsider Wicca as the shape of it and the intention of it and the focus of it. And he took matters into his own hands and decided that he was going to write a how-to book of how to do Wicca without having been through that process of having a lineage transmission and working in that ecstatic group closed experience. And he said, I'm going to use the template and I'm going to make a version of it that can be accessed by anybody who buys the paperback. And at the same time as he did that, he wrote a book about something that he called Seax Wicca, and said Wicca is I'm going to give the world the template, and anybody can fill in whatever they want, drop it in. And he was friends with a man who was starting a publishing company called Carl Llewellyn Weschke. So he hooked up with Carl Llewellyn Weschke, and Carl Llewellyn Weschke published his book. And then as Llewellyn Publications became very popular, Ray Buckland's book itself became the template for other paperback do-it-yourself books. Those early books, those early paperbacks, Ray Buckland's and the first ones after that, assumed that the person reading the book would get a few friends together and start a tradition, if you will. Here's how you can make up your own initiation. Here's how you can, have a god and a goddess, and here's how the coven should stand. Here's what a coven might look like. Here's where that sort of thing. And in the world of paperbacks, it's a very responsive world, particularly in the 1970s. You had to become a Zen master in your front living room in a paperback. I think my mother owned that. It became, within a few years, that most of the people buying the paperbacks really did not want to get a few friends together. Some did and start a tradition, but many would really like to work on their own. And here's where Scott Cunningham's book came in. So he said, I'm going to take that template and we're going to remove everything to do with the coven and initiations. And we're just going to say, use the template and do within that. Here's, 4 quarters and pick your own god and goddess. And here's how you might make it an altar. And then the generation after that was like, well, don't bother with a circle. Maybe think about intention and self-care rather than magic. But the word Wicca never dropped off the paperbacks.
Okay.
All of that process did not happen in England.
No, that was up. Yeah, that was American for the most part. Yeah.
Mm.
How do you, personal question, how do you rate these works by Buckland and Cunningham these days? Do you think that is it off the dark path, or do you just kind of say like, well, it's good to know about them, but it's not actually Wicca? How do you feel about them?
One thing that we've had to do, communities have had to do in order to help clarify what's what, as the word Wicca has traveled into wider and wider and wider meanings, and more and more bizarrely, evolving as the word stays even as what is described in the paperbacks changes. And if you're not going to be an unpleasant, grumpy old person who says young people today, then the other way to approach it is to say, okay, how are we going to describe these various things?
Right.
To acknowledge that people may have picked up a different paperback at a different point, and some people didn't pick up a paperback at all. And some, and you will find people in this country to this day who say, you can't, who did not know that anybody could use the word Wicca of themselves until they had been initiated into a lineage coven. And because we didn't have the paperbacks also about how to set up your own tradition, in England, there's only the Gardnerian tradition and its branch off, which was, the bastard child Gardnerian, who's Alexander's, who, we absolutely include in our family. But it wasn't even known. I know people who are now about 70 or 80, and they just never heard of anybody using that word of themselves to say, I'm Wiccan. To them, they never knew anybody could or even would think of using that without having been initiated. And then you show them an American paperback and they're like, oh, I didn't know.
Oh, surprise. Wow, that's incredible. I have to ask, this is a personal question. How did Wicca find you?
How did Wicca find me? I went to lunch with an old man when I was 26, and he said, do you want to go to a Crowley Gnostic Mass? It's in a house in North London.
Oh. Why not?
Because it was the 80s. And we did not have cell phones, and we had adventures. I said, sure, I'll get in a stranger's car and drive across a city I barely know, into a neighborhood I've never been to before, into a stranger's house that's completely dark. where people I've never met are doing a ceremony that I'm not quite sure I understand. I kind of, I, as it turns out, they were absolutely wonderful people. They were about my grandparents' age, and their friends were wonderful. And I had been a solitary Wiccan. I'd read Scott Cunningham when I was 23, and because I lived in America, my mother's American. So here I was in London, and I knew, and I just knew, and just knew. I just knew. I said, these, I will sit on the doorstep of the temple for as long as I have to, and I did. And then eventually they let me in.
That's fantastic. Wonderful. We've done a lot of talking about the history and a couple of the people involved with the early stages of Wicca and how it became a somewhat worldwide phenomenon. And it is truly a worldwide phenomenon. We haven't really talked about any of the beliefs. What do people that call themselves Wicca or who have been initiated into Wicca believe? What are some of the more unique aspects of Wicca regarding the things that what people put on their altars? Like what are the things that one can say that's uniquely Wiccan?
Interestingly enough, belief is not at the core of it. Okay. Practice is.
That's cool. That's how it should be.
A Wiccan is a person who, I'm speaking of initiatory Wicca here, right? Because that is what I do. That's what I've done for 35 years. It's what I know best. It's what I'm immersed in, and it's what I was passed and given to, and have been found so meaningful I've never left. So that is what I can speak on, and that's what I will speak on. It's on practice, and the practice is, for one thing, it's absolutely regular. It's not a dip in, dip out thing. Practitioners practice. And I met I have an Indian friend, and she's an initiate of Tantra, and she says, "Oh yeah, we do the things. Do you talk a lot about what you believe?" She goes, "Oh no, we never talk about that." And I'm like, "We don't either." So that's one thing. And another thing of it is the sense that what we do in that space, that liminal space, we call it the space between the worlds, is a space in which we go into an altered state in various ways that we experiment with. What works for one person works for another person. We do transpossession, we do ecstasy, we do meditation, is in aid of immediate, immersive, identity blending experiences with the sacred that is essentially wordless. And one of the characteristics of initiatory Wicca is how little is written about it, how little is said about it, and how little it is theorized. And I would say that's one of its most beautiful and most frustrating qualities.
Okay.
One of the most gifted priestesses I know, who's becomes absolutely transformed in ritual, and carries the whole thing and carries the people with her. If you ask her what she does and how she could defend it, she could not give you, she couldn't say anything. And we don't have an Augustine, we don't have an Aquinas. It is so committed to embodied, immediate, non-verbal experience that we don't theorize it.
So something that you brought up, we had a preliminary Zoom meeting about 5 days before we recorded, was the idea of Gardner's Book of Shadows. And for people maybe that don't know, can you explain what a Book of Shadows is and just why you feel that the Book of Shadows is not the textual like Bible of Gardner, specifically Book of Shadows, not the textual Bible of Wicca?
I mean, that's it's a fact. It's not.
Yeah.
The being a practice-based thing, most of which doesn't have words, where there are words, and it is when you do have words to top and tail things, or for a few special occasions you want certain few words said, those are written down because they are either caught and you have to remember them verbatim, memorize them, or they're done very infrequently, such as initiations, and in which case you need reminding. And the Book of Shadows I think the closest simile that I could describe is a choreographer's notes on the back of an envelope. So if you take a choreographer's notes, you haven't seen the ballet, you haven't danced the ballet, you don't know what the ballet feels like, and you actually really don't even have the notes of the things that the choreographer knew so well that they didn't need to write down to remember.
That's very well put. I love it. When I was sitting in that barber's chair, she's cutting my hair. She started to talk to me about Wicca and her understandings and her beliefs of Wicca. And she mentioned two figures that I'm sure might be familiar to a lot of people that probably don't know a ton about Wicca, but they know these two things, which is the mother goddess and the horned god.
Mm-hmm.
What are these things?
Yeah, it's gosh, Theology of Wicca is is an amazing and funny thing. I'm going to talk about theology, not belief.
Sure.
Because I think that's as best I can. That's an appropriate way to say. The early Gardnerians, as I will call them, the New Forest Coven and early onwards and early Gardnerians to this day, will say what Gerald Gardner put in writing many times and said many times to his friends. All people who have a sense of the spiritual, all human beings, in fact, encounter three great forces that change them: life, death, and love. Right. And all religions will embody and make myth around those three great forces. Anywhere you go, Mongolians, Inuits, people in Java, in the forest, if you want to come up against their religion, you will find death, life, and love. And he said, and wrote fragmentarily, because he was a fragmentary writer, but he said, the witches, as he found them, and then he himself as well, do a set of personifications. He said the witches personify life as goddess, and they personify death as a horned god. And he says, I don't know why they do this. He writes this in Witchcraft Today and in a couple of interviews. I don't know why they do this, but they do. I'm just telling you. He said, this is not all everywhere you go. Of course, you will find gods of life and goddesses of death, but this is what the witches do. They personify life as a goddess. And you can kind of think of that as lunar and watery and sort of like Aphrodite and sort of like Artemis. She's sort of lunar, she's sort of Venus-like, but she is life, and she is in her flowering in the light half of the year. And they personify death as a horned god. And he says, maybe because hunting is really important to primal people, maybe, and death involves killing. But he said, I don't really know, but that's what they tell me, and that's what they do. And he said, and then there's a third thing, which is ineffable and you can never pin down, and that's love. And that flickers through, and witches also worship love. He just said that then there's this dance between life and death and love. And he said, but he's very lovely, because he did actually put it in writing as well. He's telling people, he said, woe betide any of us if we forget that these are personifications. We're really in trouble. And maybe because he was reacting against, Christianity, like this is the true God. And he said, these are personifications, and we must remember that. Really what we're worshiping is we're reverencing these immediate encounters with life and death and love.
The big things, the
big things. Yeah. So it's, I read, I do because I'm a reader. Once you're an academic, you're always an academic. Very easy and glib things. Wicca is duotheistic. Wicca is addicted to heteronormative binary. Wicca is failed polytheism. Imagine the comedy of worshiping somebody who we think now is the pretend goddess Aradia, and a Gallo-Roman god called Cernunnos. What a historical joke that is, to put those two together. And in fact, it is not the early Gardnerians are very, very clear that they believed in immediate local goddesses, but when they were leaning into their practice, and to this day, when we lean into our practice, we're leaning into those forces that make us weep, make us cry, make us hope, which is life, death, and love.
Very cool. Well put. So you've talked a bit about the goal or ambition of a lot of what people who are initiated in Wicca do, things, ecstasy, immediate gnosis, understanding, all of these kind of things. And so that's how ritual plays a part in Wicca. I have to ask you, though, because this is a podcast, it's in the title of my show. Where does magic come in? Where is magic and Wicca? Where do they meet? What do they do? How do they interact? Do they? Don't they? Let us know.
It's the we meet on full moons or near enough full moons, as well as on the eight points during the year, the agricultural year. And the old teaching is, which my people follow, and I pass on to my people, is that at the Sabbat we are raising energy from our bodies, because that's a Wiccan teaching, is that the biggest source of energy is our bodies, and we are transforming ourselves and having ecstasy, but and in that we're also giving energy to the old gods, so they can have our energy to hopefully come back and make the world less oppressive and patriarchal, even theistic. So we give to the gods, and then at full moons, when we do magic, we ask them to give to us. So it's a reciprocal I-thou, to quote Martin Buber, an I-thou relationship. And so we do magic at Esbats, at full moons, and we have most traditional Wiccan magic in initiatory Wicca is communal, it's ecstatic, and it does not involve a lot of bits of string and wax and bits of herbs. It can, but that's not the core. That is not the primal. That's not the primary way of doing magic. The primary way is working together in basically ecstatic dance or other techniques of raising energy together as a group, and then directing that. And this ties into the fact that Wicca is both private and communal, and that there is a rule that you have to, in order to go into a circle, whether it's celebratory or magical, you have to be okay with the other members of the group. And again, it's like, friendship is really powerful. We underestimate the love of friendship, I think, in many societies, including ours. It's an immensely powerful kind of trust and intimacy and giving and taking. So, yeah, that's the magic.
Let's hang in there with this. I think it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of Wicca are the covens. Let's let the record straight. What you've mentioned some of the things, but what is the operant function of the coven within Wicca?
The operant function. So Wicca was one coven for. If we, I'm picking a date that I can't be fixed on, but let's say Wicca, the group of friends who were experimenting with seances and ecstatic techniques started calling themselves witches in, let's say, 1925. By the time we're at 1939, they've been going for 14 years. And that's when Gerald joins. And then Gerald and his magical partner go up to London and start inviting friends to join from 1945 onwards. 1955, 56 is when my mentor started joining. And then it's a one coven tradition from, let's say, 1925 to about 1953. 1953, Gerald starts thinking that one coven is maybe not going to keep a mystery religion alive. And he moves to the Isle of Man and starts seeing about setting up a group there, because he's living there most of the time with the museum. So then we get to about 1959, and Gerald realizes his wife is going to die soon, and he's going to die shortly thereafter. He's old. And he starts setting up this fast track system of like helping people set up covens. He's like, I'll help you. We'll do this fast. Right. But essentially, it's a one coven system for a very long time, like a one coven. So it's, so my experience comes from that background. And the core idea, and it was a one coven system for so long, it was only one coven, the whole thing was one coven. And the idea was, these are people who are friends, who have a religious calling to this kind of a thing that they cannot ignore. And they have a sense of familiarity and almost strange, inexplicable recognition with this other people in that friend group. They did a lot of past life regression and seances, and they, from the 20s onwards, and they really felt that they had known one another before in previous lives, and they were meant to come together in this life to do this work. So on that basis, that was people would join a coven to be in that safe space of that friend group and to do this thing together. So there's this great interview. Can I tell a tiny story?
Please do.
I'll tell you a tiny story. There's an interview in 1951, I think, with Gerald Gardner, and this journalist comes and has a chat with him and says, "Oh, so what do you do? What happens to witches?" "Oh," he said, what do you do in your coven?" "So what you do?" And he's very sweet. He says, "Mostly we dance a lot to drumming, and we build bonfires at midsummer, and we look after one another, and we worship the old ones." Always very generic, Wicca does not like to overdefine in reference to it. And this journalist sort of jokingly at the end says, "Oh, and well, how would I join this coven then? How would I join a coven of witches then?" And Gerald, he was not a snide man. He wasn't snipey. He just said, "Well, first we'd have to like you."
It's beautiful in its simplicity. Yeah.
We have to like you. There's this saying in early Gardnerian Wicca about, well, I'll come back to the saying, but Gerald tells a story about how he joined the coven, joined the witches. I don't know if they call themselves a coven then, but did call themselves witches. They said to him, after he'd been friends with them for a little while, they said, "We believe you were one of us before. Why don't you join us again in this life?" And there is a sense of, there is one level, in which this initiatory, still very small tradition is about people who feel that they maybe are coming back together again as friends over and over and over again. And maybe in the 1920s, they believed the project was to bring back worship of the goddess, to reclaim sexuality and physicality and goodness and pleasure as a religious values, to reclaim the body from shame, and to reclaim magic as a valid thing that you can do in a religious context. So they had goals, and they do those goals in a coven. And a coven, first and foremost, to this day, in Gardnerian tradition in the UK anyway, is the first criteria. If a coven is considering taking somebody new in, is looking for the click. Is looking, does this person fit with us? Do we feel that this person is safe with us, that we're safe with them? If you're doing frenzied ecstatic dancing and possibly crying and going into trance, you can't be doing that with people who are laughing and pointing. Those are the criteria for joining a coven. And how big can a coven get before that unity and trust starts dissolving around the edges? How long can a coven last in that shape? It's a difficult shape, I've got to say. It is a difficult structure. But I think those of us who are in it, who love it, believe it's worth fighting for.
Yeah, it's always tough for me. I've always been somebody who likes doing things somewhat solo. It's just that old adage that, 3 people can keep a secret as long as 2 of them are dead kind of stuff, right? It's just, it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, I can understand if you have something that works, just how precious that can be, truly true. Like, that seems very beautiful to me, at least. I know some people would just be like, yuck, but I think that's very interesting sounding. And and precious. No wonder you want to keep it safe, keep it secret for sure.
Also keep it alive. If you're completely secret, it will die out.
Right.
This is the great dilemma. I mean, Gerald Gardner fell out with Doreen Valiente, who was his magical partner after his first magical partner had to retire due to illness. And Doreen just was like, will you stop with the interviews? Will you just stop with the interviews? And they fell out over that after 3 years of being partners, magical partners. And she said, you just have to shut up. And, what he's thinking is, you don't know what it's like for this thing to get down to 5 people.
Right. How much younger was Doreen than Gerald?
I want to say 30 years.
30 years?
Maybe 40. I think she was in her 30s and he was pushing up to 70.
Okay. Wow. All right.
I really am. The little known factor about looking at any English lady of that generation and older is that the appearance and what is shown to the public and what is let loose in private are very, very different.
No doubt. Yeah.
I mean, the manners never slip, but she could be wild. She could be wild woman on, wow, naked on a hilltop under the moon, apart from her Wellington boots, howling like a wolf. Yeah.
She did quite a few interviews as well, though. She was after Gerald was kind of not doing very much. Did she talk quite a bit about Wicca to those that would ask?
Only when she was older. I mean, she died in the last 5 years. Before she died, she did, and she wrote. That's what she was willing to do, and she wrote. That was her tremendous thing. She wrote long after she did anything with in an organized group sense. She did write. So she was not always, she wasn't always really set up for working in a group. It's a particular social skill set that's required to get on with 8 to 10 difficult people. Or not everybody's difficult at some point, and some people can do it and some people can't.
There's no rock solid theological dogmas as far as Wicca is concerned, but what one comes across when one even takes a cursory look at Wicca is that there's varieties. You've got more varieties than Heinz, what you are a part of, which is Gardnerian Wicca. But can you take us through some of these other varieties of Wicca? So somebody you mentioned earlier, Alex Sanders, what's his contribution?
I wouldn't really call him a variety. I would just say that he developed his own style, and developed his own backstory, because he really, like many young people who have a difficult relationship with their mother, they say, "You're not my real mother. I have another real mother. She's a grandmother, and she was nice, and she told me real things." So he felt he needed to do that story, and we were all, here in England anyway. He was before my generation. People just nodded. Okay, dear, whatever you have to say. Whatever you have to say to feel okay. But immensely, really, hugely dynamic and creative person. And we say, I've got to take my hat off to his priestess, who is, of course, the core. In Wicca, the core is the priestess, and that is his priestess Maxine Saunders, who is just been rock solid in her practice. Her life journey's taken many adventures, as everyone's does, but she's here to this day, and he left the planet in 1989. So that's what we have here, really. When Wicca went to America, and Raymond Buckland wrote his Make Your Own Tradition guidebook, and many in America did, loads of people did, and some of those lasted for 1 year, some lasted for 10 years, some lasted for 15 years, and that's marvelous. But it's not something I can't really comment on those. I mean, I don't know enough to have, I don't have any opinions, because they're not something I'm familiar with.
For sure. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you yourself come across about Wicca that we can just that you just want to be like, you want to grab the listeners by the scruff, just be like, all right, just stop it. There are a couple of these. Go wild.
Well, one is that it's failed, the Gardnerian Wicca is failed British witchcraft. So one of the things that I do is I have studied English folk magic, published a book on English plant magic, and I know perfectly well that when you would pick a plant of one sort or another in 1852 or 1568, you would very likely say, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, or the name of Peter, John, and the four apostles, blessed be this plant, or whatever. That folk magic is largely the language and structure of a lot of English folk magic, as most of European folk magic is very grounded in saints and Christianity, and particularly Catholicism, especially when it became taboo after the Reformation. And also that cursing is a big part of folk magic, and making people do things is a big part of folk magic. Making someone fall in love with you, ruining someone's marriage, ripping a leaf in half in order to destroy your neighbor's marriage. So cursing is important, saints are important, prayer is important, Christianity is important, and largely it's solitary. So I know that. And Wicca, initiatory Wicca, developed itself not to be British witchcraft.
Okay. It
developed itself to be a revival of a pagan religion that is structured the way tribal religions are, using magic and ecstasy and an initiatory, ecstatic priestly core. So it's to criticize Wicca for being laughably inaccurate British folk witchcraft is like comparing apples and oranges. Yeah. And I'd like people to, I love both, but they're not the same thing at all.
I would love for people to rewind that and re-listen to that, because that's a very important distinction. That was the solve for me. And talking to you certainly helped solve that, because part of me has that chorus of people that tell me that, Wicca's trying to be English witchcraft, and it's a dysfunctional history. It's not a real history. It's got no tenure to its claim of magic. But when you explain it to me, it's like, oh, so we're talking about a state of being that's near universal for human beings. As you say, it's when these people that started the first coven, they'd see other groups of people in different parts of the world, and they want some of that kind of structure, that kind of ritual, to be able to take part in something that is innately human. That's the solve for me. That's where, like, oh, there's room for this. This is a beautiful thing as well. And so, while one can play the if you'll excuse the horned god's advocate, to say that there is zero antecedent for Wicca in something like British witchcraft seems disingenuous. Would you agree with that?
I would. I really would. And I completely understand people who would encounter the world of witchcraft today, the past 5-10 years, and imagine that Gardnerian Wicca is, initiatory Wicca is failed British witchcraft. If you live in the US, because in the US, United States, the way that this tradition is described is British traditional witchcraft, right? So that was, I think, now understandably in the United States context, where you have a lot of these later startup do-it-yourself traditions out of Buckland's template, if you want to describe the one that has an initiatory lineage that goes back to here, in America, the word you might reach for might be British, and the fact that it is lineaged and we pass on practices might understandably make a person reach for the word traditional. Here we don't use those words at all. We just say the craft. And we don't understand it as particularly British. We understand it as I don't know, something that on one hand looks to the roots of our consciousness and world practices of ecstasy and religiosity, and on the other hand looks to a future that is better than shame-based patriarchal monotheism.
You can just say, Doug, make this question go away if you really want. But you mentioned when we last talked that they really wanted to recreate's not the right word, but they really wanted to tap into their conception as to what occurred in Greek mystery traditions. Would this be a yay or a nay from you? Is that a good way of understanding it? Yeah.
Yes, because yes, but it is not Greek recreationism either. Right. Because, I mean, for example, like Gerald Gardner lived amongst the Sea Dyaks in Southeast Asia, who have amazing tattoo practices, by the way, and he had tattoos up his arms from the Sea Dyaks. But that's not the point of what I was going to say. The point of what I say is he saw transpossession happening practices there. He was a respectful guest, and he got included and invited into practices that white people were not normally invited into. He was really, really polite, respectful guy. And there was a member of the Coven who had lived in Ghana, where you have ecstatic dancing with drumming and transpossession and secret societies of the what you call they call them witch doctors. So they understood closed practice as universal. And given that many of them knew the Mediterranean very well, because people who were able to travel, and many of these people were middle class and upper middle class, could take boat journeys and then they would see Greek things. So they said, oh, this is what's the nearest version to us is the ancient Greek mystery cult. There's a lovely postcard. There's this absolutely lovely postcard that Gerald sent when he went with his magical partner to Pompeii, and they went to the Villa of the Mysteries, which was just newly opened in the late 40s, early 50s. And he showed this postcard to somebody, he doesn't say who, and she just nodded and she said, looking at this postcard of the Villa of the Mysteries fresco, with a flagellation as part of the initiation. It's just, she said, yes, they knew it too.
Lovely. That's great. Here's the big question, and be as candid as you like with this one, but why do you think that folks within magic look down on Wicca? Why do you think that people that call themselves, I use the term, practical magician, others will say ceremonial magician. Why do you think that people would have magician somewhere in what they would call themselves? Why do you think they look down on Wicca?
I think that's a culturally specific reaction. I think that's not so much a reaction here in the UK. Where we don't have that great multiplication of paperback books or TikTok that use that word for practices that are less and less and less like anything that I would recognize. And if something seems as fragmentary and shallow as what I see on TikTok or in some of the more recent paperbacks, I frankly would be quite dismissive too. I think the problem is that word has traveled with so many different things that, including extremely disparate, fragmentary, and sometimes shallow and ill thought out, ways of approaching things are. So that's one answer. The other answer is that the US had those books and that were very simple paperbacks written in very simple terms that said very explicitly, Wicca is simply a template. And the template is a circle with 4 quarters. Pick a god and goddess of your choice. Here are 8 festival days, and we're going to make up new names for them. And here's some kind of cheesy third-rate doggerel poetry.
Yeah.
And any reasonable person doesn't have access to people practicing as much as they do a paperback. And if you pick up a paperback and this is what it says it is, and people say, oh, this is Ray Buckland, or this is whoever it is, and it says, this is all it is, there's nothing to it, there's no mystery here. You can't blame people for saying, oh, there's no mystery here.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems that no matter which new age occult store I go to on this side of the Atlantic, those books are all there. That's like the only thing you can find besides books on crystals. It's just, the paperbacks about you becoming a Wiccan, and
Yeah.
that's all we have. But
And I love the democratizing ethos that they had in the 1970s, which was why should you have to go to Japan and sit on the doorstep of a Zen monastery for a year to be a Zen practitioner? How elitist is that? Why should you have to try to find one of the 7 existing covens in 1971 and move there and uproot your family or leave your family or not have a family and wait around for a year drinking cups of tea or helping them in their garden as they get to know you, and they quietly introduce you to other members of the coven, but not say that's what it is for a year, and then eventually say, yes, you can join. Like, why? I mean, that seems so difficult. And the early 1970s were about reducing barriers.
right.
The price of that was many beautiful, subtle, and deep and sacred things were presented as simplistic.
But here's the thing, and I'm not saying this to try and throw a barb your way, but what would you say to people that would say like, well, Christina's view of Wicca is an elitist view. Like she wants it to go back to these closed groups. She wishes that Cunningham and Buckland never wrote their books. Like she wants to keep Wicca, to stop Wicca from being the thing that it is now. What would you say to something like that, like a charge?
I would say, I don't wish that hadn't happened, because I think that template is a really, really great template for people to have a personal spiritual life with.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's been super helpful is to now we say initiatory Wicca or Gardnerian Wicca.
Yeah.
Gardner would die. Gerald would die. I know he would die if he heard that, because he was like, I'm just a member. You can't call it after me. His high priestess would kill him, right? His magical partner would kill him. I mean, he wrote this book, and he was going to like, oh, I'm writing about Wicca, and they finally gave him permission to write about Wicca. And I have these letters. I've seen these letters written to a friend of his. He said, they made me cut this entire section. She just said no to that whole bit. I have to fill something else in, right? The man was like, there it is. But nevertheless, we have to have, in order to respect everybody's way, we sometimes have to clarify. I mean, I think it's helpful to say, are you a solitary Wiccan? Are you an initiatory tradition? If you're an initiatory tradition, there is more than one, particularly if you're in the US. Which one is that? So we can just, the word Wicca can't fulfill all those, can no longer fulfill all of those qualifications. If somebody wants to become a Zen monk, you will have to go to a Zen monastery, and you will have to sit in silence, and you will have to eat rice. I don't care if that's elitist, that's just a fact.
Right. Do you think that the democratization of the more, I'm just going to use the word shallow, but not shallow in the sense that they don't have meaning, but just shallow in the things that, Buckland and Cunningham were trying to promulgate. Do you think that it was a good thing for the world that everybody, should they want to, could maybe perhaps call themselves a Wicca or call themselves a witch? Let's just go that vague, like just to be able to call themselves a witch. Do you think that that's a good thing?
Sure. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's such a big word, and it's such a powerful word.
Yes.
And it's meant so many things to so many different people, that I like words that have an edge. I think that words that have an edge make us sit up and pay attention. And then a word that's used as broadly. I mean, I grew up in West Africa, where you use the word witchcraft, and it's not a good word. It's never a good word there. It's a word that makes you ask more questions. So in that sense, things that make us ask more questions can only be good.
It's odd when we try to define so much I agree with you that witch is a term that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's not something that I call myself. I've always been one of those people that kind of has that Peter Gray-esque, you'll find a witch at the end of a pointed finger kind of thing. Like that's
Yeah.
I don't even know what to call myself on the at the best of times. I have to ask you,
I
Christy.
think I'm always very cautious around identity politics.
Yeah.
I think I prefer to say what I do rather than go into the realm of what I am.
Yeah.
But I think yeah, I'm gonna ask you. I'm gonna give you a part two to a question you asked about 20 minutes ago, and that's what are some of the misconceptions or ideas about initiatory Wicca that
Definitely.
that really stand out for me. And I think as we've been speaking, another one, I think the other big one that I come across a little bit amongst the traditional witches, as I call them, they're called here the Gemma Gary witches, the Emma Wilby witches, the Robert Cochrane witches,
Right.
who people practicing and working in folk magic, witchcraft. And it's as if you're not a real witch if you don't curse. And in my tradition, we are forbidden from cursing.
Okay.
And so I come across that, and I'm like, yes, but no. and again, it loops back to this thing of what do we mean when we say witch? In British folk magic, witchcraft, of course, cursing is, maybe whether somebody does it or not, it is very much part of that panoply of practices. In the way that the word witchcraft was used in the early 20th century, and the word Wicca was adopted around in the 1940s by that coven, that group of people that coalesced into the coven, they used the word witch the way that Edwardian anthropologists use the word witch and witchcraft, which is any tribal religion that has a magical priesthood, a priesthood that practices magic and works with spirits. So, I mean, I somewhere in my book Dreams of Witches, I quote an anthropological or ethnographic study that says, I'm paraphrasing, the author says, well, most religions around the world are best described as witchcraft. So that's the word used in that sense in that era. And those practitioners will have different names, different places they live. Victorians called them witch doctors in Africa, or southern Africa, they're called Sangoma. They might be called a shaman in Mongolia, different names to different places. But it is that person who works with spirits, probably part of a secret society, but it does some secret rituals and some for the community. And they are consulted by members of the community when they've got problems. They're part psychologist, they're part doctor, they're part spirit worker, they're part ancestor worshiper and ancestor intermediary. And that is what Wicca, this New Forest Coven, if you will, and its descendants, that we're in that lineage of people who are hoping that, yes, we have that private practice that is immediate and ecstatic. And then in our communities, we aim to be good people who are trusted and trustworthy. And people who are trusted and trustworthy are people who generally keep their word. They're generally people who you can count on not to curse you, who will try to find a wise person's solution. You can't be trusted if you're volatile. And to play that role in your community, whether it's on my street or in my local community or in the local business association of my bookshop, if I'm volatile and spew threats, I cannot be the person who's consulted when there are problems, because I wouldn't be trusted. So in this sense, the word Wicca is adopted in as the people who aim towards being a wise person.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we're not aiming to be shallow or Pollyanna-ish, or see everything with rose-tinted glasses, or not understand evil in the world, but rather to do that to whatever extent we can in our personal life, to be somebody who holds that ballast.
Yeah, that's very well put. I like it. Yeah, it's this odd thing. I've come across that too, that you can't call yourself a witch unless you do malefic magic or something like that, or even the term left-handed will get thrown. It's just like, everybody get over themselves. Truly, I'm too old for that. I don't know. Anyways, I have to ask you, Christina, what do you see as the future of initiatory Wicca? What do you see, and what do you think the future of non-initiatory solo Wicca is? This is a two-parter. So the Wicca that you were involved in, and then the more democratic Wicca. What do you see the future of both being?
Do you want my hopes or do you want my worries?
Anything, truly, as long as it's interesting. It's a podcast. No, but for initiatory Wicca to survive as an ecstatic practice, that people still have to be able to have a concept of friendship and have a concept of the value of things that happen in private. We're in a voyeuristic society. And how? Yeah.
And so, it's very, if initiatory Wicca is going to survive, there has to be a way for those of us who are in a tradition that says, look, we do things in private because it's a free space, it's a liminal space, it's a space that's not quite in this world, and we won't talk about it when we come out of it, because that it helps keep it functional in our psyche as that space between, and helps our fellow travelers, fellow Coven members, because we are Coven based, the people who trusted us with their deepest feelings, their biggest hopes, maybe their most ecstatic release moments. They know that I'm not going to go home and talk about it, and I know that they're not going to go tell their neighbor, like, you wouldn't believe what this girl did last night. To have that safety, so if we're going to survive, there has to be a way to talk about private spaces. And for our society, or people who might be considering this kind of a path, to understand it in that way. If Wicca is going to survive, it also has to, I would say, for the Gardnerian tradition, for us to survive, we need to remember to value ecstatic experience in the present and not become obsessed with dynastic lineage, although we do have an energy transmission that is lineaged, but it is not a family tree study society. If we lose the ecstasy, we lose the whole point.
Yeah.
For wider Wicca, I think if people in any form can find a spirituality that's rooted in nature, that involves putting their hopes and dreams into a cup of tea or a bath or some salt or some herbs, or doing something nice for a neighbor who's lost their cat, whether it's like tying up 3 pieces of string, that's a gift, and it's embodied. I like that. I like that those things attend to the corporality and the sensuality of human experience. And I think that anything that is spiritual or emotion-based that attends to the body can only be good.
Yeah. Do you suspect that it will get more popular as time goes on, or do you suspect that the naysayers, the people that are like, it's not historical witchcraft, their voices will get louder and people just move on to something different? Or do you think that it'll continue to grow? Because it's still growing. This stuff is not dimming. It's that moon is not on the wane. I hate to say, like,
I think in the initial tradition, it's in the initial tradition, people who take to it. Not everyone takes to it.
No, yeah.
But people who take to it don't leave.
Right.
Even if they can't justify it, don't have words to explain it or defend it to anybody. I know so many people who are in their 70s and 80s who started when they were in their 20s and 30s. And the phrase I keep hearing over and over again amongst people in my more local community, yes, but it works. And what that means is I feel the connection, I feel the group, I feel the transcend. I am having transcended experiences regularly, and I'm happy. I've become a person who's happy in their skin. And so the external, as long as the people who would really love it can find it, all is well.
Then let's head there then. So what would you say to somebody who's listened to all these words about initiatory Wicca, at least, and says, yeah, I love this. I want some of this. I want the tenet of friendship to be a truly sacred thing to me and how I operate in the world. And I want to have these ecstatic states. What would you say to them would be the first steps? Because it's tough out there. It's not as easy as just going to that new age bookshop and grabbing that Buckland off the shelf. There's steps that you have to go through.
There are steps. Say there's a book that I recommend, and it is an American book, so this is particularly useful for an American audience. But it's called by Thorne Mooney, is the author, and it's called Traditional Witchcraft. Okay. And it is called Traditional Witchcraft in the American parlance, by which it addresses people who might be considering or looking into the initiatory traditions of Wicca. The author is grounded in the Gardnerian tradition. Another book that I really recommend is Vivian Crowley, who's a Jungian grounded psychotherapist, who is a long-standing priestess. And she takes a look at Wicca through a Jungian lens. Mm-hmm. She's a very profound mystic and a very, very gifted poet. And she writes in a very clear, both those books are not going to excite somebody who's looking for an academic exposition. What they will do is give somebody a sense of clear pointers. And then where you find that community is there's a Facebook group. It's called Gardnerian Seekers and Initiates, or Gardnerian Seekers Group. And there's also one called Gardnerian and Alexandrian Seekers and Initiates.
Okay.
And those groups are vetted. And most covens are inclusive of gender diverse people and queer people.
Yeah.
There are a few that are not.
Yeah.
Which and one of the big things that is said about Gardnerian Wicca is it is heteronormative and binary, and one has to say there's a qualified yes there, because if there is a mythos in which death dances with life, and one is personified as a goddess and one is personified as a god, and if you worship life, then they're a part of the practice, not the whole practice, but part of the reverence has to be for the act that creates life.
Right.
Now, whether or not that's your favorite way of having pleasure is irrelevant to the point that there is an act that creates life, without which we would not exist, I would not exist. And that act, amongst many other things, is one of the things that is reverenced. Also reverenced is friendship. Also reverenced is confronting death. Also reverenced is personal gnosis of ecstasy. But there is a wide range of things that are different, one of which is the act that makes life. Pleasure is also massively reverenced. And for some people, it is that act. And for other people, it's lots of other things.
Right. The Vivian Crowley book, was that Wild Once?
It's called Wicca. It's her book Wicca. It's called Wicca. It's been out in several editions, and those editions have a different subtitle every few years.
Okay. Sorry. Wow. Amazing. After all we've talked about today, I know it's tough. It's tough to get to that quintessence of each episode that I do. And I try not to do this to most of my listeners, but I know that I know for a fact that 80% of my listeners are coming into this one with a prejudice in their head. as to what
Right.
Wicca means to them. So after all we've talked about today, Christina, and what you've said has been very lovely and very beautiful. And I was that person who, 6 months ago, until I actually started to talk to people who were involved in initiatory Wicca, I was one of those people who was like, fake history. It's all made up. I believe everything that Ronald Hutton wrote in Triumph of the Moon. And you've said that he got the history wrong. You said Triumph of the Moon, great book. History's wrong. The history is the most important thing for me. So if he got it wrong, I need to relook at this. Yeah, I was that person that was like, it's not, I know it's not for me. I don't want anything. It's just, it's all made up. Therefore doesn't matter. And now it's like, no, it seems very beautiful. It seems very nice. I will admit, no initiatory Wicca person that I've ever interacted with has been an asshole. I will say that they're all been very, very nice people. Anyhow, this is very long-winded to just ask you if there's what's the one thing that you wish people would understand about Wicca? It's tough.
I would say that it's possibly the most demanding magical practice that I've ever encountered.
Okay.
Because you're up against yourself every 6 weeks, every 3 weeks. You're up against who you are and who you are with yourself, who you are with the infinite, who you are with death, who you are with life, and who you are with love. And it is easy for that to seem like it doesn't exist because there is no written text for it. You can download a PDF of the Book of Shadows and you won't find that there. The practice is where you find that. And showing up, no matter what, is a discipline that doesn't, because it is so nonverbal, there isn't a hiding place in technique and words and self-aggrandizement. And I know many amazing Thelemites and many amazing grimoire magicians and many amazing ceremonial magicians, all of whom, like, my friend group is very, very mixed. And what you have in Wicca is there's no place to hide. And I'm not saying that not everybody in any other magical tradition hides behind that, but there is something to hide behind in Wicca. I don't find that. It's you and the candle and the being there and what you're there to be. And either you can be in yourself or you gotta go.
Have there been moments, just personal question, have there been moments where you've ever felt like, nah, I want to try something else? Or has it been, this is mine, Wicca, this whole experience is mine?
I was one of those people that the minute I encountered it, even before I met the people, I felt that I had inexplicably knew that it was for me, to the point that if I believed in reincarnation, I would say I was destined for that this time. And I can't justify that, and I can't get into debate about it. I've studied Kabbalah. I'm good friends with grimoire magicians. I hang out with Thelemites, and we get on great. I've never been drawn to do anything else.
That's a special thing, right? When you find it, you find it. Amazing. Christina, I have had an absolute blast today. Please tell us what is going on in your world. You teased that you mentioned a book. I don't think we're going to talk about the book that's upcoming, although we're not going to put a date on it, but you have a book that's already out, a Song of Witches. Can you tell people about this book?
It's called Dreams of Witches.
Dreams of Witches.
That's right. Dreams of Witches, published by Blackletter Press.
Yes.
For those of you who are interested in the landscape in which initiatory Wicca formed, it's extracts from things that the people around the New Forest Coven would have read and been influenced by, or things that I don't know that they read, but I know that were in publication around that time and before. And I did introductory chapters. So there's a summary of the history stuff without footnotes. But I can reference everything that I've ever written because I'm trained that way.
That's right.
So that's out. I don't know where it's available in the US. That's one book. And then for those who are interested in folk magic, witchcraft, folk magic practices, I have a book out called Treadwell's Book of Plant Magic, which was meant to be a 4-page stapled leaflet and became a 60-page book and has over 200 footnotes.
Academia strikes again.
I know, I can't get away from it.
Yeah.
So that's, and I'm my research area is the history of initiatory Wicca and really the history of ideas. It's not that difficult to get on ancestry.com, and if you know a few names, you can out people. I'm really interested in the history of practice and idea. Yeah. So that's what you can all look forward to if you want to look forward to anything I have to say.
There is, yes, and as you said, there is a book at some point. We're not going to put a date on it, but there's going to be a book about Wicca, most likely appearing at some point. Is there anything else you could use? I don't want to twist your arm too much, but is there anything else you might be able to tell the listener? Because I know there's people listening to this is like, oh man, I want to hear more about Christina.
I thought there are various things on YouTube that I've done. Okay. I think I did a history of Wicca going to the US. Okay. I did that for Children of Artemis, with people who do Witchfest. I think that's on YouTube somewhere. And I did a YouTube on if somebody's looking for a coven, what they should look for, what the red flags are, and what they should, what might be some green lights, what might be some red flags, and a little bit about what to expect.
Tell us about Treadwell's. Now, for folks who live in North America, some of you might be like, why is Doug so obsessed about a bookstore? Well, for one, I love books. And when I first walked into Treadwell's, it was mind-blowing. I thought it was the greatest place I've ever been. Truly, like it's the greatest bookshop. It's the kind of bookshop where if there was just one of these stores in North America, then every single one of us in North America would make a pilgrimage to this store. So Treadwell's, the bookshop. You said you started it after dropping off of academia. You're just like, I'm done with this. Man, tell us about making that leap and why you did that. And because it's such a fascinating thing that something like Treadwell's can exist and that it's yours, truly.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. You're really, really kind to say those things. I was an academic. I did my doctorate, and then I had a postgraduate fellowship, and then I was a university lecturer. In America, you call that a professor. So for an American audience, I was a professor of medieval history. And I did that for, I guess, 12 years. And at some point, I realized I'd ended up down a very narrow end of academic history, which was theological ideas transmitted through manuscripts in the 9th to 10th century between Carolingian Europe and post-Carolingian Europe and monasteries in Ireland. And
very specific.
It was very, very specific as scholarship becomes more and more specific. And I stopped having fun. I thought, this is not my world. I've been a pagan and an initiate of witchcraft since my early and then mid-20s. And I was then 40. And I thought, I'm going to do something now. I'm just going to jump ship. I'm going to jump ship. So I jumped ship and opened Treadwell's. And the idea of opening Treadwell's was for there to be a bookshop where people who are bookish and people who are ideas people and people who are practitioners could meet in a space of mutual respect. And 22 years ago, most practitioners were very anti-academic, and most academics were very sneery about neo-pagans, as they called them then. Gullible people, silly people, fringe people who did magical practice. And I thought it would be nice to make a place where those crossroads could meet. And we started our lecture series within a month of opening the bookshop, 2 months of opening the bookshop. We had our first lecture. And I came out to the academic world. And people were very, very surprised. I'd been in the closet. And I made a rule. We started the lecture series, and I said to scholars, academics who are coming, I said, I want you to come talk about your field of interest, whether it's, Platonic philosophy or ancient Greek religion or what have you, or spiritualism in the 19th century. But the rule, you can speak here, and I will ask you to speak, and I will pay you. However, you will not make sneering remarks to the practitioners in the audience, who are very bright people, and they will take away something that's more personal than you mean.
Right.
And I said to my practitioners who came and talked about their practice or came along, I said, you will not assume that the academic is your enemy.
Right.
And you will not blame them for not believing. They can give you something that is valuable to you. And don't worry about their personal beliefs. And I'm very proud of everybody who's been part of that process. And the world looks quite different now. I won't say it's because we had any part of it, but we did do our bit for that to be that meeting place, where the rule is also the other rule I made was no gossip on premises.
It's a good one. Wonderful.
I don't know. And people have been so supportive. I got a phone call at 1 a.m. 5 years ago from a friend of the shop who said, do you want to rehome Pamela Coleman Smith's fireplace? Now, Pamela Coleman Smith, for most of your audience, knows she's the artist who painted the Rider-Waite tarot deck. She was an initiate of the Order of the Golden Dawn, but Catholic version with A.E. Waite. And her house was being restructured or refurbished, and the current owners didn't like her fireplace that she'd had installed, but they knew it was hers and she loved it. And that was where she and her partner, who's a woman, had centered their life in their living room. And I got that phone call at 1:05 in the morning. At 1:07 in the morning, we co-owned it. And 2 months later, it was installed in the basement of our shop. And that happened because people are so thoughtful and kind and generous. And somehow they think of this as a place that something like that can be, that we will share and make available to everybody. And we do.
I literally got an email yesterday from somebody who listens to my show, who came to the Treadwell's talk, and they said it was so great to see you, Doug. But what was more great was the fact that I could be in and amongst people that believe in this stuff, or maybe are just very interested in it. I'm not going to quote them word for word, but they just said, I don't feel like I'm treated like I'm insane. It's a very beautiful thing. And Treadwell's is indeed, besides just being a beautiful thing, the selection of books is unparalleled. It's every shelf is like, oh, I'll take this one, this one, this one. So let the folks know you do online orders are a big part of what Treadwell's does.
Yeah, we do. We have an online shop. You just click a button on our website and we post anywhere in the world. Unfortunately, the cost of postage is insane. It is not our fault. Yeah. We'll say we charge and often undercharge postage.
Yeah.
And we don't charge for the cardboard, we don't charge for our label, we don't charge for the ribbon. Listeners, you may be shocked at the price of the postage, and frankly, we are too. Yeah. But if you're not too shocked, we will send it to you, and all of our parcels are gift wrapped.
Where can people find Treadwell's on the World Wide Web? Is there
type in Treadwell's books, we come up. It's treadwells-london.com.
And you're on Instagram as well.
We are on Instagram. We're not on X because they thought we were an underage teenager and wiped our account. 48,000 members.
Are you serious? Okay. Don't worry, you're not missing anything. It's an elephant's graveyard over there these days. It's just not a very good place. Wonderful. Please, everybody, if you live on or anywhere in the British Isles and you have not made a trip to Treadwell's when you're in London, please, you have to go. If you're listening to my podcast and you live on the British Isles and you find yourself in London and you haven't been to Treadwell's, shame on you, but also just go. It's the coolest place on earth. I love it so much. And thank you so much for giving me the privilege to talk there, Christina. it's going to be one thing that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Truly, I can say the people that I met there, my talk was like the least interesting thing. I think I did a terrible job. I was kind of nervous, but it was such a privilege to be able to meet some of my listeners and my Patreon supporters, and to meet you, and to just be able to spend more time in Treadwell's. It's just it's my favorite place on earth. So thank you for all you do, and thank you for coming on the show. It's been such a delight, and I really truly hope if some point in the future, if I was to ask you to come back on the show, you'd be like, let's do it. I'd hope that. I wish that.
Yes. Yes, I'd be delighted. Thank you so much for having me on your show, and thank you for being such a gifted interviewer. And it's really been fun to have a chat.
I will have plenty of links to Christina's bookshop, Treadwell's Books in London, as well as a ton of show notes for this episode. And they're really, really good show notes, as Christina was talking about some of the places that you should go and seek out if you're a bit more interested in initiatory Wicca. Those are all available at the website, which is my homepage, whatmagicisthis.com. Please head there for all of those links and the show notes. They're going to be really, really good. Please, again, check them out. So do you think that I'm doing something pretty important with What Magic Is This, and you'd like to show your support in some way? Well, now you can. And there's 3 ways of doing that. Let's go through all of the ways. The first way is the absolute best way. It's a thing that keeps me alive. This podcasting is my job. This is what I do for a living. I wake up and I work, and I usually work, well, I 10, 12 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. It's a full-time gig, and I can't do that without your support. So the best way of supporting me is through Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find any number of the support me on Patreon buttons there and links. There's a lot of them there. It's only $7 a month, and that gives you access to all kinds of things. I have so many offerings there on Patreon. It also allows you to be able to pick what topics get chosen for this podcast. I do polls every month as to what kind of things that I create for the Patreon supporters there. There's episodes about saints and angels and spirits, demons. Again, I did one about gnomes. I've got a ton of content, or as I like to call them, offerings on that Patreon there. All kinds of really great stuff. And again, $7 a month. Also, I put up last month, I put up the talk that I gave at Treadwell's with Christina. And in fact, I would love to share just a little snippet of it. We talked for about an hour, and so that is up on the Patreon. So this is the very first question that Christina asked me for that talk. This is a little snippet of my answer, and the interview goes on from there. And there's also a question and answer that we did for about 15 minutes towards the end. It's all awesome. So here's the very first question that Christina asked me, because we're talking about grimoires and the things that I really love and enjoy about grimoire-based magic. So here's the very first question and a clip from that interview that I did with Christina back in June of 2024. Here it is. Have a listen.
And when Doug and I spoke on a Zoom or on a phone, it was
Yep.
a Zoom, and we were trying to work out what we should talk about and what I should ask him about. And we got there, and I said, look, what I want to ask you about is grimoire magic. And your specialism is in helping people, or engaging with that process, from being somebody who reads texts and wonders about doing it, to turning off the lights, lighting the candles, putting some incense on, and actually standing up out of the chair to make and actually starting to do. And that's a difficult transition. Psychologically, I don't think it's an easy one for any of us, even if we can't remember quite when that happened. And it happened a long time ago for some of us. But it's a very important transition, and it's often one that is possibly, one of the most interesting points in a person's magical life, if not their whole life. And that's the point I want to talk about tonight, and that's the bit I'm going to be asking you about. And I'm just going to start. You ready for me to start?
Absolutely.
You're comfortable talking?
Absolutely.
What was the grimoire that made you say, I want to be able, I dream of doing, not just reading?
So I'm going to try to not repeat myself, because a lot of times I get interviewed about this on other podcasts. So I'm really going to try and not repeat myself in this manner.
This is the grimoire specific interview, though.
it's the one that everybody looks at and is just like, I want to do that. It's the Ars Goetia from the Lesser Key of Solomon, right? You see those seals and you see the list of those 72 demons or infernal spirits, and you see what they can do, and you want to do that, right? And so there was a book that was very instrumental in my life for just wanting to do that kind of magic, and that's Lon Milo Duquette's My Life with the Spirits. And I kind of take my magical life, which is about 20 years now, and kind of divide it into two. And it's about a 10-year period for both of that magical life or careers. The first 10 years, for the most part, started off with chaos magic, and then I kind of drifted into, because Alan Moore said so, drifted into Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, Thelema, and things of that variety. And I wasn't finding I was doing great with the Golden Dawn more. I use the term lodge-based magic. And I just found it wasn't really doing the things that I really wanted it to do, as beautiful and austere as it is. And if anybody's a Thelemite, amazing. Keep to it. But I wasn't finding I was doing anything other than just meditating and and doing what the books tell me to do, or what Uncle Al tells us to do. But Lon Milo Duquette talks about in My Life with the Spirits. He said that he wanted to do the other stuff. He wanted to do what was called like low magic by his magical supervisor. And so he talks about a ritual in My Life with the Spirits where he does a summoning of Oribas, which is, if you look at the Dictionary Infernal or pictures from the Ars Goetia, it's a horse demon. It looks like a horse. And he tells this really funny story about how he was at his lowest of his low, and he really wanted to try this magic, and something happened where I think he got some kind of resin in his eyes, and it started burning in the middle of him doing the magic. And he said he saw the spirit, and he said like he was so frustrated with his life and with how horrible the ritual is going. He saw the thing and he was commanding it there. And so, of course, the Ars Goetia is like, you know what? I could probably do better than Lon Milo Duquette. So, you started to look at the Ars Goetia, and then you start getting the things together. And this was, I'd maybe been doing magic for about 6 years by this point, and it went horribly. It was terrible. Like nothing happened. I was in a 1-bedroom apartment in Edmonton, Alberta, where it's 8 months of the year it's winter, and it sucks and it's terrible, and nothing happened. But the Ars Goetia was the book, the grimoire, that truly made me want to look into that. And then what you discover once you look into the Ars Goetia is that that's not the only grimoire, right? There's more of them. There's a lot more of them. And so eventually you find out that it doesn't have to be the summoning of these 72 specific demons, that there's other ones that can do other things. And so, but to basically answer your question, the Ars Goetia is just the one because Uncle Lon Milo Duquette was like, this is the one that I did. And so I wanted to be like him.
And so it goes on from there, and it is such a wonderful interview. I had such a great time, as I just mentioned at the end of this episode. It was fantastic. And so you can hear the whole interview, all 1 hour, including the Q&A, on my Patreon. Again, it's only $7 American a month. That's absolutely nothing. That's basically 2 bags of potato chips. If you go to a fancy restaurant, that's a bottle of sparkling water these days. Truly, $7 a month is absolutely nothing. It gives you access to so many wonderful things. My Patreon content is literally the best stuff that I do. In my opinion, I think I do such great work. I know a lot of people really love this main podcast. It is great. It is wonderful. But the Patreon offerings that I have up there for exclusive Patreon supporters are the greatest thing that I do. I have so much fun. I get really creative, and there's so much great information there. I would love to see you there, and I would love to have your support. Right now, if you check it out, you might be like, oh, Doug's fine. He's got about 650 people. Half of those are people that have joined my Patreon for free, so they don't get the exclusive content. I have about 370 paying supporters. I would love to have some more because, again, this is what I do for a living. I cannot do it if I do not have your support, and Patreon is the best way of supporting me. $7 a month, please. please support if you can. It keeps me alive, keeps me doing this thing that I love to do and what I love to share. It keeps What Magic Is This going. If you do not like doing the paying a monthly sum every month, then there is PayPal. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on any number of the PayPal buttons there. You all know what PayPal looks like. It's the double P. It's that PP. Find the PP on What Magic Is. Wow. Terrible. I'm going for kindergarten jokes. But anyhow, you all know what that PayPal logo looks like. Click on that. You can donate $5, $10, $20, $2,000, $200,000. Any amount helps, and it helps to keep this podcast ad-free. It goes right back into the expenses for having this podcast run. I spend about $200 a month just to make sure that I have all of the proper plugins, the hosting, both on the internet and for the podcast itself. It's not as simple as just signing up to that DIY, do your own podcasting stuff. I want to have the absolute best quality for everything with the most space and all of the things that make this podcast sound as good as it does. I just got an email from somebody basically saying, we're starting our own podcast. We love how your podcast sounds. We'd like to have our podcast sound the way that your podcast sounds. And I'm about to reply to them being like, well, I hope you have, I hope you have a lot of money to spend, because it does take quite a bit of cash to make sure that the podcast runs the way that it does. And I just had to pay a whole schwack of things, and it's not cheap. So if you donate through the PayPal, any chunk of change is greatly appreciated. It just goes right back into making sure that the hamster on the hamster wheel that keeps the What Magic Is This machine going is well watered, hydrated, fed, and fit to be able to continue to produce these wonderful podcasts. So PayPal is a really great way of supporting me if you do not feel like going the Patreon route. So PayPal is another option. The third way of supporting me is by showing your support, and that is through grabbing some merchandise. Oh boy. If you want t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, fridge magnets, stickers. I love the stickers. I just put a sticker on something recently. It feels so good. It's like I'm in grade 6 and a wannabe poser skateboarder again by putting my stickers on stuff. It's great. But yes, head to What Magic Is This. Go to the menu there, click on merchandise, and that'll take you to my TeePublic store. Now, I don't get a ton of money if you were to buy a t-shirt or a hoodie or even some kids' clothes or things like that, but it does help, and it allows you to show your support. And if you are out and about wearing a What Magic Is This t-shirt, or you have a What Magic Is This tote bag, or a mug, or one of those thermal coffee mug things, I forget what they're called anyways, or even a phone case, you can grab a phone case. If you have any of that stuff, please take a picture of it and send it to me. I would love to see it, because it's just so wild and crazy that I have merchandise and things, and my logo is out into the world. It is really cool. I am my best customer. I recently just purchased some stuff, because there's about 12 designs up there. They're all really awesome. Most of them are designed by me. I'm sure there's something there that you will really, really like. So please head to What Magic Is This. Go to the merchandise button there in the menu, and you can find all sorts of things. I would love to see you wearing a What Magic Is This t-shirt or a hoodie. That would be so cool. Again, I don't get a ton of money from that, but I do love to see that kind of thing out in the wild. It is always appreciated. But again, and lastly, the best way of supporting me, and I do this every month, the best way to support me is through the Patreon. 7 beans a month. That is nothing. It keeps me alive. It keeps me fed, and it keeps the fires on here. And I cannot do this show ad-free without your support, and I would love to see it. Let's get me to 400 paying Patreon supporters here before the end of the year. I would really greatly appreciate that. So all of these things, including the show notes and including a way to find Treadwells on the World Wide Web, all of the things, please head to whatmagicisthis.com. Thank you so much for truly giving us the actual details of something that most people probably going to say that, I know about it. Well, I don't think you do. And there's much more to be learned. And there's what's interesting about the research that I did for this episode is that when you mentioned a couple of authors whose work I had to look into, is that the story is still being told. It's not finished. There's still things that we're discovering, and that's beautiful. We're watching the unraveling of a history that hasn't been told yet, and I think that's a very cool thing. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, it is unrolling as we speak.
Fantastic. Oh, Wicca, that's it, everybody. So you might not have asked for it, but too bad you got it. And I really hope that you enjoyed it. And thank you so much again, Christina, for coming on the show. And that's it. Until next time, everybody, come on back to this 4-quartered, horned, lovely, beautiful thing that we like to call magic and witchcraft and the occult. Until next time, I want each and every one of you to stay healthy, to stay hopeful, and to stay luminous. Until then, take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Ta for now. Bye-bye.